So for this week's lecture, we're going to look first at the theme of genocide in the context of two wars, focusing primarily on the Armenian genocide of the First World War, but also drawing some comparisons with the Holocaust in the Second World War. And then we will look at the nature of military occupations during the two world wars, again focusing primarily on the First World War, uh, but also zooming in on some of the moral and ethical dilemmas that arise in situations where we have military occupations. We'll begin by looking at genocide, and I apologize in the following slide the background noise in the audio is a little bit higher than I would have liked. The microphone wasn't quite set up properly, but it returns to normal in the slides that come after that. So please excuse that extra background noise.
We should begin by developing at least a working definition of genocide so that we can all agree on what it is exactly that we're talking about here. Genocide, as the term is defined today, is not a purely 20th century or 21st century phenomenon, although when it's used in present day rhetoric, that's usually the period that it's referring to, that we're referring to. But there are examples of genocide from throughout history, certainly from before the 20th century. But as a term, genocide was coined in the 20th century and sort of formally defined in the 20th century, and it was in the 20th century, particularly before 1950, so really overlapping with the period of the two world wars, that genocide became especially prominent as a sociological phenomenon, and also its relationship to warfare changed as total war became the principal expression of warfare during the first half of the 20th century, or at least the principal expression of the larger wars of the first half of the 20th century, and even for that matter of the second half of the 19th century, in particular the American Civil War. So the term itself was, as far as anyone seems to be aware, was coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin's dates, he was born in 1900 and died in 1959, not surprisingly, overlap perfectly with the period of time where modern understanding of genocide and the modern experience of genocide was so fully accelerated. And he used the term, in writing for the first time, or at least that we're widely aware of, in a book that he wrote in 1944 called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And the book was partly about the persecution of European Jews by the Nazi Germans, but it also explored earlier examples of genocide that predated the Second World War, and Lemkin in particular was interested in the genocide perpetrated against Armenians by the Ottoman Turkish regime around the time of the First World War, during the First World War period, particularly in 1915 and 1916. And Lemkin himself, I would just like to say a few words about his biography, because his experience, it's fascinating. His experience from childhood up until sort of the formative part of his writing career lines up perfectly in so many ways with the experiences of the two world wars, such as we have studied. So when he was born in 1900, in Belarus. It was under the control of Imperial Russia, and when the First World War broke out, when Lemkin was a teenager, there was heavy fighting, of course, between the Central Powers and the Imperial Russians in Belarus around the place where Lemkin's family had a farm, and so they had to hide out during the fighting and to avoid trouble with the Germans. And then after the First World War, when the modern state of Poland was created, Lemkin found himself in Poland. So he lived in Poland. He was ethnically Polish as well. He found himself in Poland during the interwar period, and was still living in Poland when the Soviets and the Nazis jointly invaded Poland in 1939, which we've talked about in an earlier lecture. And only narrowly did Lemkin manage to escape capture by German forces in 1939 or 1940, thereabouts, making his way first to Sweden, where he was safe from persecution by the Nazis, and then ultimately to the United States. So he was one of relatively few Polish Jews who survived the Nazi occupation of Poland. And Lemkin, in his book Axis, Rule in Occupied Europe, sort of developed the groundwork or the framework for our contemporary definition of genocide. And here I'm borrowing from the United Nations definition, which Lemkin was instrumental in developing in the later 1940s. And according to that definition, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And the acts include, naturally, we're not surprised, the outright killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or other forms of harm to the group. It doesn't actually have to be a physical harm. It could be other forms of harm. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, every single one of these measures, for example, we see in the Nazi persecution of the Jews and other ethnic groups in the Second World War. Every one of these actions, and we can find these actions also in earlier genocides, which we are going to one of which we're going to consider today in the context of the First World War. This being the genocide against Armenians living under the control of Ottoman Turkey during the First World War. Now, I want to point out, just for the sake of due diligence, that not everybody today necessarily embraces this precise definition of genocide. The UN definition of genocide, and I'm only covering it here in broad brushstrokes, has some fairly specific requirements. For example, in order for a series of actions to be considered genocidal, it can't simply be the case that a few random individuals of a particular ethnic group are targeted. They have to be consciously targeted because of who they are in ethnic, racial, national, or religious terms. And a substantial number of people in a group have to be targeted. How that number is calculated, I really couldn't tell you, but according to the UN definition, it has to be a fairly substantial number. Not the whole group, but at least a substantial part. And furthermore, as we maybe find in all kinds of legal definitions of crimes, there has to be intent. There has to be clear intent behind the actions to target an entire or large segment of a group, to cause serious harm to a group, to deliberately inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction, etc., etc. There has to be an intent behind these actions, which is genocidal in nature. In most major instances of genocide, it's not difficult to find this intent. But there has to be an intent of a genocidal nature that is a function of the national, ethnic, or racial, or religious characteristics of the group. It has to be motivated by that identity, not by some other circumstance, but by the identity itself. So this is a definition that the UN has adopted, the United Nations has adopted. But there are certainly others in this day and age who have a somewhat more liberal approach to defining genocide, and are maybe less specific in the terms that they use to define genocide. That they could define it more broadly than the UN may, and I have no argument with that. I don't want to debate it here and now. These are legitimate perspectives in many instances. But what I want to do is to make sure that we have on the table sort of the broad official definition that the UN adopted in the aftermath of the two world wars, and based on the writing and analysis of individuals like Lemkin, who had given the matter some careful consideration in the first half of the 20th century.
Before we delve into the experience of Armenians living in Ottoman Turkey during the First World War, I would just like to pause for a moment and consider the relationship between genocide and total war in a modern 20th century context. Now, as we've already seen when we defined total war earlier in this course, total war is not a purely modern phenomenon. We can find examples of total war in earlier periods of history. But we've also argued so far that there are some features of total war in a 20th century context which are unique. For example, the nature of total war in the industrial age is or has been unique because of the extent to which destruction can be visited on civilians using weapons of strategic range, such as long-range bombers, submarines, and so forth. So there are some unique features of total war in a 20th century context. And likewise, genocide is not purely a 20th century phenomenon. Raphael Lemkin wrote about all kinds of, or analyzed all kinds of genocidal undertakings that predated the 20th century. But again, there's something unique, or there are a set of characteristics that are unique about genocide in the 20th century, which also seem to be related to the industrial age, but furthermore to modern nationalism and other such political and cultural developments. And we find as well, not surprisingly, that genocide and total war seem to have a special relationship in the modern context, which sets it apart from earlier pre-modern or early modern experiences. And we shouldn't really be surprised that these two phenomenon, genocide and total war, seem to fit together hand in hand in the context of the 20th century. Because, after all, total war in the 20th century witnessed sort of a widespread cultural, political, and social mobilization. And again, we can find examples in earlier conflicts, but not to the same degree. For example, in earlier conflicts, nationalistic sentiment in the modern sense is often missing. But that is a key feature of social and cultural mobilization in the 20th century context. So one of the key ingredients